He didn't knock. Reverend Silas Mercer shoved through the door of Nathaniel Cross's ranch office so hard it cracked against the wall, and before Nathaniel could even rise from his chair, the older man was already talking. "I need you to marry my daughter." Nathaniel Cross set down his pen slowly. "Say that again." "Rebecca, she needs a husband before the baby comes." For a long moment, the only sound in the room was the wind rattling the window glass. Nathaniel stood, walked to that window, and looked out across the yard. And there she was. Rebecca Mercer, standing alone in the snow with one gloved hand pressed protectively over the curve of her belly, staring at nothing. "I barely know her," Nathaniel said. "I know." "Where's the man who put that baby in her? Why isn't he the one standing in my office?" Silas didn't answer that. He looked down at his hat, turning it once in his hands, and when he looked back up, his voice had lost all its pulpit steadiness. "She needs a home before that child comes into this world, a name, a roof that won't fall in on her." "And you think I'm the man to give it to her?" "I think," Silas said, "you're the only man in this county who won't make her pay for another man's cowardice." Nathaniel looked at Rebecca again, still standing out there in the cold like she was waiting for the ground to open up and take her. Something in the set of her shoulders, not fragile, not broken, just braced, made him stop reaching for another argument. The silence stretched long enough that Silas nearly spoke again. Then Nathaniel said it. "I'll marry her." He offered him a marriage deal after his pregnant daughter was left at the altar, and it would be months before either man understood why the answer had come so fast. Now ask yourself, would you have said yes that quickly? What kind of man agrees to marry a stranger, heavy with another man's child, without asking a single question about why her own fiancé disappeared? And what is Rebecca so afraid of that even her own father is willing to hand her to a widower rancher just to keep her safe? Stick around, because nothing about this story is what it looks like on the surface. And if slow burn Western romance is your kind of story, hit that subscribe button right now, because this one only gets deeper from here. 3 weeks earlier, Rebecca had stood at the front of a packed church in her mother's altered wedding dress, watching the doors at the back for a groom who never walked through them. Caleb Thornton was gone. Not late, gone. His horse gone from the livery, his saddle gone, every coin he owned gone with him. By the time the whispering started, it had already hardened into fact. Caleb Thornton had run because Rebecca Mercer was carrying a child, and he wanted no part of it. Rebecca never said a word to defend herself. She stood there in that ruined dress while the whole town rearranged its opinion of her in real time, and she let them. Her father's face had gone the color of ash, but the strange part, the part nobody in that church noticed, was that Rebecca wasn't crying like a woman whose heart had been broken. She was watching the door like she expected something worse than a jilting to walk through it. That was the detail that should have told them something. It didn't. Nathaniel Cross had buried a wife 6 years before, and never once considered filling that empty side of the bed since. His ranch was modest, but it was respected, built plank by plank with his own hands after the fever took Sarah in a single brutal week. His sister Dorothy ran his household with the precision of a woman who had never once been asked her opinion and had stopped waiting to be. His younger brother Everett, 19 and still sharp with grief of his own, made his feelings about a stranger moving into their home known the moment he heard the idea out loud. You're going to marry a woman you don't know, carrying a baby that isn't yours because the Reverend asked you to? That's about the size of it, Nathaniel said. Why? Nathaniel didn't have a clean answer for that, not when he was ready to say out loud, so he gave his brother the only true thing he had. Because nobody in this town is going to give her a chance to be anything but a scandal, and I've got room in my house and nothing left in my heart for anybody to break. It wasn't romance. It wasn't even close to romance. It was two people standing on the wreckage of two different disasters, deciding to build something out of the pieces. When Nathaniel and Rebecca finally spoke alone, he laid it out plainly, like a business arrangement, because that was the only language that felt safe to both of them. Separate rooms, he said. No one will force affection on you. What's yours stays yours. I'll provide for the child same as if it were my own blood. And if you ever want to leave, you leave. Nobody in my house will make you feel small for what happened to you." Rebecca studied him like she was waiting for the catch. When none came, she said, "I have one condition." "Name it." "I won't live here as charity. I want to work, real work, not busy work you invent to make me feel useful." A faint, surprised smile crossed Nathaniel's face, the first one Rebecca had seen. "Then work," he said. It wasn't love, but it was the first true thing either of them had felt in a long time, the strange, steadying dignity of being taken seriously. Rebecca arrived at the Cross Ranch with one trunk and no illusions about how she'd be received. Dorothy was polite in the clipped way of a woman reserving judgment. Everett barely looked at her. The foreman, Harlan Reed, watched her from across the yard like she was a fence line he didn't trust to hold. Rebecca understood within the first hour that she hadn't just married a man, she'd walked straight into a family that had never asked for her. She burned the first dinner she tried to cook. She startled the horses without meaning to. Everett laughed, once, sharp and unkind, and Rebecca's face went hot with humiliation, but she didn't run to her room and she didn't cry where anyone could see her. She simply tried again the next day. It was in the ranch ledgers, a week later, that everything shifted. Rebecca had asked to help with the books, anything to feel useful, and within an evening, she noticed the numbers didn't sit right. Cattle sold, money that should have followed, and a gap between the two that didn't add up. "These figures are wrong," she told Nathaniel, sliding the ledger across the table. He barely glanced up. "I've kept those books for 6 years." "Then look again." He did, and she was right. Nathaniel sat back slowly, staring at the numbers like they'd rearranged themselves in front of him. He didn't praise her. He didn't make a speech. He just said, "Show me where you found it," and pulled his chair closer to hers. Harlan happened to be in the doorway for that exchange, and something in his face shifted too. Not trust, not yet, but the first crack in his suspicion. In the weeks that followed, Rebecca learned why the door at the end of the hallway stayed closed. It had been his wife's room, left exactly as it was the day she died, and Nathaniel never spoke of it. Rebecca never pushed the door open, never asked the question everyone else in town whispered about behind his back. She simply understood, without needing to be told, that the man wasn't cold. He was terrified of loving something enough to lose it again. Nathaniel noticed that she never judged him for the locked door, and something in him, some old iron bolt he'd driven shut 6 years ago, began, just slightly, to give. One evening he caught her carrying a feed sack far too heavy for a woman in her condition and took it out of her hands without a word. "I can manage," she protested. "You don't have to prove you're worth keeping," he said. Rebecca went very still. No one had spoken to her like that, like she already belonged somewhere, since before the wedding that never happened. That night, without telling her, Nathaniel repaired the loose step outside her bedroom door so she wouldn't trip going up in the dark. He never mentioned it. She noticed anyway. "If you're already rooting for these two, drop a comment below telling us who you're pulling for, Nathaniel, or a version of Caleb we haven't met yet, because everything is about to get a lot more complicated." Going through Caleb's abandoned trunk one afternoon, Rebecca found a folded letter tucked into the lining. It was in Caleb's handwriting, and what it revealed changed everything she thought she understood about the man who'd left her at the altar. Caleb had discovered that his own father, Josiah Thornton, was manipulating land deals across the county, forging boundary lines and swindling struggling ranchers out of property that should never have changed hands. And then, one line near the bottom, in ink. Pressed so hard it had nearly torn the page. "If they learn what I found, Rebecca will be the first person they come after." He hadn't run from her. He'd run to protect her. Rebecca's hands were still shaking when Nathaniel came home that night with news of his own. His cattle payments had gone missing too. The same tampered numbers Rebecca had first caught in the ledgers, now revealed as part of something far bigger. Josiah Thornton was systematically defrauding ranchers across the entire county, and Nathaniel's spread was next on the list. Then the warning arrived, nailed to his gatepost: leave it alone or lose the ranch. Nathaniel didn't leave it alone. Within days, cattle went missing in the night. A fence line was cut clean through. Smoke curled up from a corner of the barn before Harlan and Everett together beat the flames out with wet blankets and sheer stubbornness, working side by side until both of them were black with soot. When it was over, Everett looked at Rebecca, who'd been hauling water buckets the whole time despite her condition, refusing to be sent inside, and for the first time, he didn't look away. "You didn't have to do that," he said. "Neither did you," Rebecca answered. Something between them loosened that night. It wasn't friendship yet, but it was a start. The town, quick as always to believe the worst, began muttering that Nathaniel Cross had brought this trouble on himself the moment he married a Mercer. That was when Josiah Thornton came to him directly, standing in the yard with his hat in his hands and a false kind of gentleness in his voice. "Walk away from the girl. Stop asking questions about the land records. Do that, and all this trouble disappears." Rebecca stood at the window and watched Nathaniel's shoulders go rigid. "Get off my land," Nathaniel said, "before I forget what kind of man I am." It cost him. Every head of cattle he'd lost, every foot of burned barnwood, every ounce of goodwill in town, it was all the price of refusing to trade Rebecca away for peace. And Rebecca, watching from that window, understood for the first time that this man had chosen her even when choosing her was expensive. It was Rebecca who finally cracked the whole scheme open. Poring over the county's old property records late into the night, she noticed something everyone else, lawyers, surveyors, even the sheriff, had missed. Every fraudulent land transfer relied on the exact same altered boundary measurement, copied from deed to deed like a signature. She found the original untouched survey buried in the courthouse archive and laid it beside the forged ones. She brought the proof straight to the sheriff herself, Nathaniel, at her side. 2 days later, Josiah Thornton was arrested in the middle of the county land office in front of half the ranchers he'd swindled, the forged surveys spread across the counter as evidence. He didn't go quietly. He shouted that Rebecca had ruined him, that she'd twisted her own son against his blood. Rebecca didn't flinch. "Your son ran because he was afraid of what you'd do to me," she said. "I'm still standing here. That should tell you which one of us was right." Thornton was led out in irons. The fraud, and the man behind it, were finished for good, not with a rumor, but in front of the whole county. The woman the town had once pitied as a ruined bride had just saved half its ranches, including her own husband's. Caleb returned not long after, thinner and more sunburned, carrying the weight of months in hiding. He told Nathaniel everything, the threats, the disappearance, the fear that staying would have gotten Rebecca killed. He apologized to her directly, voice cracking on the words. Rebecca listened, and when he finished, she didn't run to him. She looked instead at Nathaniel standing quietly by the porch rail, and that single glance told Caleb everything he needed to know. "She deserves a man who stays," Caleb said to Nathaniel, and then he was gone for good. Dorothy found Rebecca alone on the porch that evening, still shaken from the day. She sat down beside her without a word, and after a while she said, "I wasn't kind to you when you first came here." "You didn't owe me kindness," Rebecca said. "No," Dorothy agreed, "but you've more than earned it now." She reached over and took Rebecca's hand, and neither of them said anything else. They didn't need to. Rebecca went into labor on a night thick with rain. Nathaniel paced. The hallway outside the room his own wife had died in, years of buried fear rising up all at once. For one terrible moment, he nearly turned and walked out the front door rather than watch it happen again. Then Rebecca called his name. He went in. He stayed. And when the baby's first cry cut through the storm, Nathaniel Cross held the child in his arms and said nothing grand, nothing rehearsed, just a whisper meant for no one but that tiny, furious, red-faced newborn. "You're safe." Everett was the first one allowed in afterward. He looked down at the baby, then at Rebecca, and said, quiet enough that only she heard it, "I'm glad you didn't give up on us, even when I gave you every reason to." "Nobody worth keeping gives up that easy," Rebecca said, and Everett almost smiled. Weeks later, with the child asleep in the next room, Rebecca found Nathaniel on the porch and reminded him gently, "You said I could leave once I was ready." You can, he said. Would you want me to? For the first time since she'd arrived, Nathaniel let the wall drop entirely. No, he said. The arrangement ended a long time ago, Rebecca. I don't want you here because of a promise I made your father. I want you here because somewhere along the way, you and that baby became my family. They were married again that spring, not out of necessity this time, but choice, in the same church where Rebecca had once stood alone, waiting for a groom who never came. This time, there was no whispering, no scandal, no obligation dressed up as duty. Rebecca walked down that same aisle, and this time, Nathaniel was waiting. And this time, she wasn't afraid. She had come into his life because one man abandoned her. She stayed in the end because Nathaniel Cross never did. If this story moved you even a little, don't scroll past without hitting that like button. It tells us to bring you more stories exactly like this one. Subscribe if you want to catch every new frontier romance the moment it drops. And down in the comments, tell us, was Nathaniel right to say yes that very first day? Or did he take the biggest gamble of his life? We read every single one. Thank you for watching until the very end. We'll see you in the next story.